Hey everybody. So today we're going to try and make a magical wizard staff, something inspired by nature, so some druidic magic. Here I've got a Procreate app drawing that I used on my iPad just to kind of get the framework done for this. I wanted to get the idea out of my head and get it onto some paper so that I could eventually print it off and trace it onto some wood and begin the project from there. I've been playing a lot of D&D recently as a wizard character, and so I thought it'd be a fun project to go in and build a staff made of wood and then accessorize it with whatever I could find at the local mall. So I knew in my head what colors I wanted to use, and I wanted it to be kind of a darker wood with some accents of green moss and some really cool looking crystals. The final project is going to look a little different than this rendering here because it was just the first kind of prototype design that I came up with. But I knew most of the elements were pretty consistent with what I wanted the final product to have. And all in all, I'm happy with how it came out. So we can take a look at this step by step. Overall, the price to this wasn't too bad. I think the wood ended up costing maybe $9. But some of the crystals were a little bit more pricey, coming in upwards of $20 for the largest crystal on there. So I would say it probably ran me a total of $50 to make this whole thing. Alright, so the first step for this staff, once we have our generic design, print that out onto some paper, tape it to a board. In this case, I went to Home Depot and picked up a 2x12 for $8 or so. Trace the design onto it. This is going to help us in the carving portion, which is going to be the next step. So it's key that you get a nice thick line so you can see it. And here's just kind of an example of how thick that line is. You could really do any design you wanted here, so I just kind of came up with something on my iPad, something that I thought was a little interesting, not too straight. I wanted this to be very, very organic because it's a nature-inspired staff. So a lot of curves, a lot of rounded edges. Now the fun part, we get to bring out some tools and start actually carving the staff out of the wood plank. So there was not a great way to go about doing this because of how large it was. So just to go ahead and get the size to be a little bit more manageable, I went ahead and trimmed away, not exactly to the line on the staff, but just a little bit offside of it, using my jigsaw here. It's a Ryobi battery powered one, which actually worked really well. I think I didn't even go through an entire battery in this one. But here's just kind of an example. It was a very, very slow process to go in. But once I kind of got it to a little bit more manageable size, whole thing weighed probably 15 pounds, and it made it nearly impossible to work with it on the scroll saw. But that is the next step, just using the line as a guide. You can just see I'm slowly tracing this out. It was a long project. I ended up actually moving away from my desk. Here you can see I've got it bolted to the workbench, but I'm actually going to have to end up moving it over to a mobile station because of how large the staff actually is. So after going over the entire form with the scroll saw, I think I've got something pretty close to what I was hoping to get out of it. If you look at this, it's not perfect. I didn't necessarily need to cut it perfectly to the line because a lot of this is going to be carved and then following step here. So I think this is good enough for what I wanted. It took a rather long time, probably well over an hour in scroll saw cutting. So at this point I think I was just kind of glad to be done with it. So you got some jagged edges there, but they will work. And I think the overall form of this staff was a little big, so it made it kind of awkward to use it on the scroll saw at certain angles. So I was sitting here kind of pondering how I wanted to handle this. I ended up finding a multi-tool. So this is a Ryobi oscillating multi-tool that I was able to find a wood cutting tool attachment for it. And actually this was a fairly fun process. It was very similar to something that I would expect maybe ice carving would be like. So I just took the vibrating saw head and just chiseled away the wood and just kind of got it down to the form that I wanted. It was very rough here that you can see, a lot of tool marks, which unfortunately I think those kind of come back to bite me in the end result. But more or less, it's a nice tool that was able to make this a much easier process than doing it by hand, using like a rasp or anything like that. So I would highly recommend getting one of these if you plan on doing any kind of power carving. But you can kind of see the overall form here. This is pretty much what I was looking for, and I was really happy with the result of carving out this wood. Okay, so now that we have our form carved away from the wood, we need to go ahead and smooth it up. So I've got a handful of different sanders here, so I was just kind of trying out different ones and seeing what I could get to work. This is a random orbit sander that was doing okay on certain parts, like the edges, but it was really hard to navigate the internals of some of the crevices on this staff. So I ended up having to swap over to a few different sanders until I found one that I really liked, which was a continuation of that oscillating multi-tool that we used to carve the staff. I actually found a triangular sanding head for it, and then ended up ordering from Amazon a whole bunch of different grits on it, and that will end up being the primary sander that I use. But you can see here I'm just kind of slowly working away inch by inch on this staff. It was quite a lengthy process. Here you can see the multi-tool that I was referencing. It's got a nice little triangular sanding head to it, so it's really easy to get into those crazy curves. And again, this was a long process. We can already see, if you look at the staff here, this is getting close to the end of it. Quite a few hours of sanding. This was definitely a multi-day project. I was hoping to run through pretty fast, but I think the entire first day was me just cutting this out and then sanding it down. Okay, now that the sanding is done, it's time to move on to a much more fun process. Is going to be the staining of the staff itself. So mixing up some, I believe this is ebony stain, one of the darker colors that I could find. It actually looks really good prior to the final coat of sanding. So using the oscillating multi-tool, I was able to get to about 220 grit. We'll eventually end up going much higher, but I wanted to get the stain on there first because as you start getting into that higher grit, it's hard for the stain to actually properly soak up into the wood. So just kind of an example of going through the staff. I think I ended up doing 3 coats of this stain. So you wipe it on, let it sit for a couple of minutes, then wipe it off with a rag. So here I'm just kind of wiping it on, and eventually we'll end up wiping it off once I get the full staff coated. From there you let it rest for about 2 hours, and then you add in the next layer of stain, and you do that 3 times. If you notice, for those who are pretty observant, you'll see that I've actually carved out some holes for the crystals. It was not super interesting, so I didn't end up recording it. Just using a Dremel to drill in some holes, essentially. So here I've got lined up a bunch of different sanding pads. These go on an attachment for the drill. You can kind of see it right there. So it just spins in a circle. It's not oscillating or like a random orbit sander, so it does leave a lot of machining marks, which unfortunately wasn't the best, but it was surprisingly good. I ended up getting those on Amazon for probably under 20 bucks. So just like the previous sanding, this was a multi-hour process. In fact, I didn't account for the stain to be removed so easily. So as I was going through and sanding this, I noticed it was getting much too light for my preference. And here I am just kind of trying out different grits, working my way up from the 220 starting grit to 600 to 1200, then up to 2,000 and 3,000. And then towards the end, I'll do a wet sand using the 7,000 grit sandpaper. That'll be towards the very end of this project, though. Before I go too much further, I went ahead and temporarily placed in the crystal. I wanted to burn in some runes. This was an idea that I had when I initially was sketching out the image, and so I went ahead and took this opportunity to go ahead and start doing this. So you can see I've got a wood burning tool and a very sharp edge on it, and I'm just going through and just letting it carve in the runes. Now, I don't know a lot about the runes themselves, so I went onto Google, found a lot of Nordic Viking-esque runes, printed those out, taped them to the wall, and then just kind of copied the ones that were easy enough to do. Since these were all straight edges and all the runes, this was actually a pretty easy process. It took a little bit of time because the wood itself was rather hard to burn through, but with enough patience, it actually turned out pretty nice. I was really happy with the final result. Here's a better angle on that final rune here, just adding some of the finishing touches to it. All in all, I really like the way these came out. You can see I'm just trying to round off the edges by putting a little bit of pressure on the tool and just pushing into the wood and just letting it burn, and then rotating the tool just a little bit to thicken up some of these lines. Because of the nature of this staff, I wanted it to look more handmade than mechanical, so I like the way these runes ended up coming out because they're not perfect. And they really do look like something that was just kind of burned into the staff magically, and that's what I was going for. Now at this point, this is where I was really not satisfied with the stain of the staff. As I worked my way up into the higher grit on the sandpaper, a lot of that stain was getting removed, and so you can see it's very light. Going back to my original drawing, I wanted something that was a lot darker. So I believe it was off camera, I ended up going in and doing 2 coats of straight black stain on top of all this. Okay, so here you can see where the wood got much darker. But at this point, it was so dark that the runes themselves wouldn't really show up. So I had a really fun idea. I took the best gold paint that I could come across, which I ended up purchasing from Hobby Lobby. It was rather cheap. But what I'm doing right now is taking a very small paintbrush, dipping into the gold paint, and then inlaying it into the runes. So all you have to do on this, it doesn't have to be very precise. Just get the paint to fill in the crevices, just like so. And typically what I would do is, since this paint doesn't dry quickly, I will end up going through and doing anywhere between 1 and 5 runes at a time. Once you have the rune fully filled up with gold paint, you take a wet rag and you just wipe it off. And it gives an interesting effect, almost as if the runes are inlaid with gold. Overall, the paint itself probably came up to being pennies of what I ended up using. So this is a really cheap way of adding some very nice detail into the staff. And with all the paint in place, it's time to wipe it away using a few back and forth strokes on a wet rag. We're able to remove all the paint from the top, and what's left is just the paint that's inside the grooves that were created from the wood burning tool. Alright, so at this point I finished up the runes. I used some epoxy to glue in some crystals. I did a little rope handle wrap. You can just kind of follow a paracord wrap. And for the final touches on the staff, because again it's nature, so I wanted to add in some foliage to it. And the way I did this was by taking some moss from a kit at Hobby Lobby, and then just using my hands, I kind of pulled it apart, grounded it up to make it a little bit easier to use. Taking some wood glue, I painted on kind of where I wanted it to sit. I then just push the moss into it, let it dry, and the following day I would come in with a clean paintbrush and just kind of remove any of the excess and make it a little bit less thick. This was a good way just to add a little color to this stuff and just kind of cover up the connection between the crystals and the wood itself and give a very nice effect. Okay, so let's take a look at the end result out in the sunlight. This was a really fun build, took a couple of days. You can really see those runes popping. The camera's not doing them justice. All the crystals look as if they are kind of generating their own nature. And it really brings together a nice magical feel for the staff. I was very happy with how it turned out. There's a couple mistakes on it, but you know, it was a fun project, and I really enjoyed it. And if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching. Hopefully this gave you some ideas on your own staff projects. I really enjoyed making this one. It was inexpensive and didn't take too much time. It's a very cool piece that I'll hopefully be able to add into a wizard costume over the coming year. So stay tuned for more.